Madam President, I rise today as I'm pleased that we are finally moving to Wall Street reform, something I've come to the floor several times to speak about, and that is critically important to our country, critically important to our economy, critically important to investors and consumers to have confidence. And I'm glad we're moving to that as a member of the Banking Committee. But at the same time, there is an enormous environmental challenge taking place in our country, one that I think portends the consequences of offshore drilling. And I rise today to discuss the tragedy in the Gulf and the looming environmental disaster that threatens the Gulf. First, I want to remember those who lost their lives in the tragic fire and explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico last week. Our thoughts and prayers are with the workers and their families. The loss of life and the injuries are truly horrific, but this is also an environmental tragedy, one that threatens to reach historic proportions. Over 1 million gallons of oil have already leaked into the Gulf. And each hour that passes without a solution, without a way to stop it, leads us to wonder what the extent of the damage will be. It's a wake-up call to all who are trying to weigh the benefits against the risks of offshore drilling as part of our energy mix. It certainly leads this senator to wonder about the wisdom and necessity of drilling off the coast of my state of New Jersey, and I would argue off the coast of any senator of a coastal state. As I stand on this floor today, and this is the fire that the Deepwater Horizon oil rig was engulfed before it sunk, and then had all of the oil spilling into the Gulf. As I stand here on this floor today, an oil slick bigger than the state of Delaware, over 4,000 square miles, is drifting towards shore. Drifting towards shore. To give you some perspective of what that means, this is how big this oil sheen is when compared to my home state of New Jersey. All of the yellow. All of the yellow. If this spill in the Gulf were happening, for example, in Virginia waters right now, my whole state would be holding its breath, because NOAA has shown my office how a spill in Virginia waters could easily wash up on the New Jersey shore. Now, Madam President, I don't know if you've visited New Jersey, but we have magnificent, pristine beaches. The dunes along the coast, they're breathtaking. Wildlife is abundant. Tourism depends on it, and it would all be in jeopardy. All be in jeopardy. Now, the next photograph I want to show is what happens to wildlife in these oil slicks. This is the photograph in the aftermath of the Exxon Valdez spill. Now, we hope and pray the spill in the Gulf stays offshore, but the reality is it could make landfall any day now, and this photograph could be repeated 1,000 times. Madam President, now we learn the spill from the Deepwater Horizon is worse than it was originally reported. Far worse, at least 5 times worse. The Coast Guard and NOAA have revised their estimate of the leak. They now say it's not 42,000 gallons per day, but 210,000 gallons a day. Imagine if the leak continues for 2 months, which seems like a real possibility at this point. In 2 months, it will have exceeded the amount of oil spilled in the Exxon Valdez disaster. But let's keep something in mind. The Exxon Valdez was a tanker with a finite amount of oil aboard. This is virtually a bottomless pit of oil. When asked to compare this spill to previous spills, The Coast Guard compared it to the Ixtoc-1 spill. Now, on June 3rd of 1979, an exploratory well called the Ixtoc-1 blew out in the Gulf of Mexico. It took 9 months to seal, and the resulting spill was the second largest in world history, over 10 times larger than the Exxon Valdez spill. As you can see from this map, which has here Texas, Louisiana, all in the Gulf, the spill traveled 600 miles from its center, 600 miles, blanketing the coasts of Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana, causing extraordinary damage. Now we're debating the wisdom of expanding oil production on the outer continental shelf, in essence, all along the coastlines of our country. Some think the way to expand offshore drilling reasonably is simply to create some type of a buffer zone off the coast, as if a little more room can protect our shores, as if the ocean was in neat little boxes that could somehow be confined. Frankly, Madam President, I think this graphic of the Ixtoc spill shows that oil spills don't respect state borders or buffer zones. In the wake of what we're seeing in the Gulf, I'm deeply concerned that the current 5-year plan, recently announced by the administration, would allow oil drilling less than 100 miles from Cape May, New Jersey. Cape May, back to the New Jersey. Cape May is a great historical place in New Jersey, beautiful beaches, some of the greatest beaches in the nation. Cape May, where Delaware Bay meets the Atlantic, is the epicenter of bird migration on the entire East Coast and one of New Jersey's most significant seaside resort communities, the 4th most lucrative fishing port in the entire nation, the 4th most lucrative fishing port in the entire nation, rich with scallop beds. It's less than 10 miles from Delaware waters that the administration announced they are studying for possible future drilling. So I'm concerned that if the lease sales go forward, the coastlines of Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey will be under threat, not just an environmental threat, but an economic one as well. Approximately 60% of New Jersey's $38 billion tourism industry comes from the Jersey Shore. And the state's multi-billion-dollar fishing industry would also be threatened by the specter of a potential oil spill. Now, we had an unfortunate incident in New Jersey's history years ago in 1987 when the shore was polluted with medical waste in that year, and medical waste that ended up on the beaches of New Jersey, syringes on the beaches of New Jersey, other medical waste on the beaches of New Jersey, and tourism revenues dropped 22% the very next year, and it took some time to recover. If a serious oil spill were ever to hit our coast, the damage would be enormously costly. And if the Exxon Valdez spill is any guide, much of the damage would be permanent. It simply does not make sense to play Russian roulette with an asset that generates thousands of jobs and tens of billions of dollars per year for potential drilling assets that could never generate even 1/10 of that. And this is only in one state. Magnify that by so many other states that have similar coastal economies. This tragedy in the Gulf is a wake-up call. It demands that whatever we do in terms of drilling, we do carefully, thoughtfully, and with the very real images of this tragedy in mind. It is obvious now more than ever that we cannot ignore the risks of oil exploration, that we cannot take the safety of these rigs for granted or the reliability of redundant shut-off systems that were supposed to prevent such a spill. It's time to weigh the risks against the payback. And what is the payback? Well, the Energy Information Administration, the entity that our federal government has to give us information about our energy sources, estimates that opening all shores to drilling would amount to no more than a few 100,000 barrels per day, which translates to a few tablespoons of gasoline per American vehicle. And we don't keep oil in a domestic market. Oil is part of a world market. So there's no guarantee that American-produced oil comes to America for the purposes that we need. Hardly a drop in the bucket with no measurable impact on gas prices. I don't want to gamble with the coastline of New Jersey or any of these other states for a few tablespoons of gasoline. Madam President, this image of a burning rig in the Gulf that ultimately sunk and for which we have all of this disaster taking place is a wake-up call to all of us who are committed to finding the best energy options for the future, options that will not put hundreds of miles of our coastline at risk. You know, I don't quite understand why it is that when we're talking about global climate change legislation, that we are in desperate pursuit of oil, which is a contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions that we are trying to avoid and, in essence, change from so that we don't have the climatic changes that can threaten our way of life. But that's exactly what we're doing, going after this, going after this. So I'm respectfully requesting that the administration reconsider its proposal to expand offshore drilling until we are absolutely certain that we can protect the New Jersey shore and the entire Atlantic seaboard from the potential environmental and economic disaster that could come from coastal drilling. I don't know why the Atlantic coast has to be under siege, but it seems to be. The other coastline was largely kept unexplored. Instead of doubling down on 19th century fuels, like oil, we should be investing in 21st century green economy that will create thousands of new jobs, billions in new wealth, and help protect our air and water from pollution. It's time for this country to move forward and embrace the future rather than clutch to the ways of the past that have not only given us this addiction, but at the same time given us the consequences in our environment of polluting it in a way that ultimately creates risk to our crops, our farmers, our shorelines, as well as our health. In terms of a state, my home state of New Jersey, which still has far too incidents of respiratory ailments, including cancers of that sort. We can do much better than this. We should do much better than this. And we should stop feeding an addiction that ultimately would only add a few tablespoons of gas and not do anything about the price, but put an enormous risk to the economy of these coastlines, to our natural habitats, and to the quality of air that we breathe. I hope the President will understand that this disaster is a wake-up call that needs to be thought of seriously before we move forward on something that can be so risky to our economy, to our environment, to our way of life. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.